You think you know how this goes. The rich alpha sweeps the poor omega off his feet. Cue the violins. Bullshit. Real life doesn't come with a soundtrack. It comes with an eviction notice, a failing prescription of suppressants, and a pink plus sign on a plastic stick. He fired me before lunch on my first day. 3 days later, he kicked my apartment door off its hinges and told me I was carrying his kid. This isn't a fairy tale. It's a hostage situation. The alarm went off at 4:30 a.m., an abrasive electronic screech that clawed its way through my skull. I didn't groan. I didn't roll over. I just sat up the thin cotton sheets pooling at my waist and stared at the water stain on the ceiling. Today was the day. I swung my legs over the side of the mattress and winced as my bare feet hit the freezing linoleum. My apartment was a shoebox in the worst part of the city where the heating was a rumor and the plumbing sounded like a dying animal. But none of that mattered today. Today I was starting as a senior financial analyst at Croft Industries. I walked into the cramped bathroom and opened the mirrored cabinet. Its hinges shrieked. My eyes immediately dropped to the bottom shelf. The suppressants. The generic brand chalky white pills that tasted like battery acid and made my joints ache. They were cheap, but they did the job. They buried my omega biology under layers of synthetic hormones, dulling my natural scent to nothing but a faint, unreadable static. In the corporate world, an omega wasn't a person. We were liabilities, walking HR nightmares waiting to happen. So I took 2. One for the baseline, one for the anxiety. I dry swallowed them, staring at my reflection. Dark bags under dull brown eyes. Pale skin. I didn't look like a corporate shark. I looked like a guy who was one missed paycheck away from sleeping on a park bench. Get it together, Leo, I whispered to the empty room. 2 hours later, I was standing in the lobby of the Croft building. It was a monument to wealth and alpha arrogance. Black marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows, and security guards who looked like off-duty mercenaries. I clipped my temporary badge to my cheap Navy suit and rode the elevator to the 42nd floor. My stomach was doing flips, but my scent was locked down. I smelled like laundry detergent and cheap coffee. Safe. Invisible. HR gave me a brief orientation. Sign this NDA. Read this sexual harassment policy. Here's your desk. It was an open-plan office, a sea of gray cubicles meant to foster collaboration. It just felt like a panopticon. At 10:15 a.m., the air pressure in the room changed. You don't need to see a high-tier alpha to know they've entered the room. You feel them. The hair on my arms stood up. The ambient chatter of 70 employees died, instantly replaced by the furious clacking of keyboards. I kept my head down, staring at a spreadsheet I hadn't even processed yet. Footsteps. Heavy, measured, predatory. They were moving down the central aisle. A scent hit me. It punched straight through the chemical barrier of my suppressants. Sharp ozone crushed cedar and something dark and metallic, like a thunderstorm rolling over a battlefield. My breath hitched. My hands began to shake. My biology, supposedly dormant, slammed against its cage. Don't look up, I told myself. Do not look up. The footsteps stopped directly behind my chair. You! The voice was a low rumble, devoid of warmth. It vibrated in my chest cavity. I turned my chair around slowly. Standing there was Arthur Croft, the CEO. He was 32, built like a heavyweight fighter forced into a bespoke Tom Ford suit. His jaw was a sharp right angle, his hair meticulously styled, but his eyes were the terrifying part. They were a pale, icy blue, and they were fixed on me with an intensity that made me want to expose my throat. Instinct. Filthy, traitorous instinct. I forced myself to stand. I was tall, but he had 3 inches on me. "Mr. Croft, I'm Leo Mercer, the new—" He leaned in just a fraction of an inch. His nostrils flared. The motion was microscopic, but in the dead silence of the office, it was deafening. I saw the exact moment recognition sparked in his eyes. The ice cracked. Something violent and possessive surged beneath the surface, but it was instantly smothered by a cold, furious mask. "Mercer," he said. The way he tasted my name felt like a threat. "Yes, sir. Senior Financial. Pack your things." I froze. "I'm sorry." Arthur didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. I said, "Pack your things. You're fired." A heavy silence draped over the entire floor. 70 pairs of eyes were burning into my back. Panic flared in my chest, hot and blinding. On what grounds? I demanded, the sheer desperation overriding my self-preservation. "I've been here for 2 hours. I haven't even—" "You are a distraction." Arthur interrupted, his voice dropping an octave. He stepped closer, crowding my personal space. The scent of ozone was suffocating. He lowered his voice so only I could hear. "Your suppressants are cheap, Mercer. You reek of panic. I do not employ unbonded omegas in my executive divisions. It is a biological liability I refuse to underwrite." "That's illegal," I hissed, my hands balling into fists. "You can't fire me for my designation. I am Arthur Croft." He stated completely unbothered. "I can fire you because I don't like the cut of your suit. Human Resources will provide you with a month's severance to prevent any tedious lawsuits. Have your desk cleared in 5 minutes, or security will physically throw you onto the street." He held my gaze for 1 second longer. A second that felt like an eternity. There was something hidden in those icy eyes. Not just disgust. Something deeper. A memory. But before I could decipher it, he turned on his heel and walked toward the glass-walled boardroom at the end of the hall. I stood there, humiliated, terrified, and entirely ruined. I needed this job. I needed the health insurance. I needed the money. I packed my single pen and my notebook into my bag. I didn't look at anyone as I walked to the elevator. I didn't cry until I hit the street, swallowed by the noise of the city, entirely alone. 3 days. That's how long it took for my entire life to completely unravel. 72 hours of staring at a peeling wall, rationing a loaf of bread, and trying to figure out how I was going to pay rent. The severance check HR promised hadn't arrived. I had exactly $42.16 in my checking account. I had called 3 different temp agencies. They all promised to keep my resume on file. That was corporate code for drop dead. But the financial ruin wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the sickness. It started on the morning of the 2nd day. I woke up, sat on the edge of the bed, and the room spun. A wave of nausea hit me so hard I barely made it to the toilet before my meager dinner of plain rice came violently back up. I chalked it up to stress. The sheer trauma of being fired by a ruthless billionaire on day 1 had obviously wrecked my nervous system. By day 3, the nausea was a constant companion, a heavy roiling weight in my gut, and my temperature was running high. I sat on my lumpy couch wrapped in a worn fleece blanket, shivering despite the muggy heat of the apartment. I reached for my phone and opened my calendar app. Next, heat cycle. In 4 days. I stared at the screen. My heats were usually regulated by the suppressants. They were light manageable. A mild fever, some cramping. Nothing more. But I had missed my period of latency. A cold dread began to pool at the base of my spine. I closed my eyes, and against my will, my mind was dragged back 4 weeks. It was a Friday night. I was exhausted, burning out at my previous dead-end data entry job. My roommate at the time had dragged me to an underground club called the Onyx Room. It was an exclusive place heavily guarded, shrouded in secrecy. Masks were mandatory. It was a place where the city's elite came to indulge without the paparazzi catching them. I shouldn't have been there. I was pre-heat and my body was already humming with that restless, dangerous energy. I remembered the pulsing bass, the smell of expensive alcohol and sweat. And then I remembered him. I was at the bar nursing a watered-down gin. He approached from behind. I never saw his face clearly, just the sharp line of a jaw beneath a black half-mask and eyes that glinted like ice in the strobe lights. But his scent, it was overwhelming. Crushed cedar and ozone. My preheat-addled brain didn't stand a chance. My body betrayed me instantly. We didn't even speak. It was pure primal magnetism. He dragged me into one of the private alcoves. It was rough, desperate, and entirely anonymous. I remembered the heavy weight of him pressing me against the velvet wall. I remembered the scrape of his teeth against my neck, not a claiming bite, but a bruising nip that left a mark I had to hide with concealer for 2 weeks. When it was over, he had pulled back, breathing heavily, adjusting his suit. He left a stack of $100 bills on the table, an insult that made my blood boil, and walked out. I took the money because I was starving, and I hated myself for it. I snapped my eyes open, shaking the memory away. Cedar and ozone. Arthur Croft. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I couldn't breathe. The CEO who fired me. The man whose sheer presence in the office had completely shattered my chemical barriers. It was the same man. That's why he fired me. He recognized my scent. He knew exactly who I was, and he eradicated the problem before it could become a scandal. But the nausea, the mist cycle. "No," I whispered to the empty room. No. The suppressants. I was on the pills. It was a 1% failure rate. I threw off the blanket, grabbed my coat, and ran out the door. The pharmacy was 3 blocks away. The walk felt like a death march. I bought the cheapest test they had, throwing crumpled dollar bills at the cashier, unable to meet her eyes. Back in my bathroom, the lock engaged, I took the test. The box said, "Wait 3 minutes." I sat on the edge of the bathtub, staring at the little white plastic stick resting on the edge of the sink. 3 minutes? 180 seconds. The faucet dripped. Drop, drop, drop. It sounded like a countdown. I thought about Arthur Croft, the cold, lifeless look in his eyes when he told me to pack my things. This was a man who fired an employee for simply existing in his space. If I was pregnant, if I was carrying the child of a billionaire who despised omegas, my phone alarm went off. The 3 minutes were up. I stood up. My knees felt like water. I stepped toward the sink and looked down. 2 pink lines, solid, unambiguous, devastating. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. The shock was too absolute. It felt as though someone had carved out my insides and filled the cavity with wet cement. I grabbed the edge of the sink, my knuckles turning white, staring at the lines until they blurred. I was pregnant. Broke unemployed and pregnant by a man who had already thrown me out like yesterday's garbage. A sharp, violent knock on my front door shattered the silence. I jumped, nearly knocking the plastic stick onto the floor. I shoved it into my pocket, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Who is it?" I called out, my voice trembling. The knock came again, louder. The cheap wood of the door shuddered. I walked out of the bathroom and down the narrow hallway. I pressed my eye to the peephole. The air in my lungs vanished. Standing in the dingy, flickering, fluorescent light of my hallway, flanked by two men who looked like walking brick walls, was Arthur Croft. I backed away from the door. My hands were shaking so violently I had to press them against my thighs. How did he know where I live? The answer was obvious. He had my employee file. But why was he here to threaten me? To make sure I kept my mouth shut about the illegal termination? Open the door, Mercer. His voice didn't come through the wood. It bypassed it, entirely rattling straight into my bones. It was an alpha command, low-laced with authority demanding submission. My knees buckled slightly, my Omega biology screaming at me to obey, to unlock the door and bare my neck. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper. I used the pain to ground myself. Go to hell, I shouted back, my voice remarkably steady. You fired me. We have nothing to discuss. If you don't leave, I'm calling the police. A heavy silence followed. For a second, I thought he actually left. Then a metallic crunch echoed through the hall. The door frame splintered the deadbolt, tearing cleanly out of the cheap wood. The door swung open, hitting the interior wall with a deafening crash. Arthur stepped over the threshold. He looked entirely incongruous in my apartment. He was wearing a charcoal wool overcoat over a dark suit, his leather shoes immaculate against my scuffed linoleum. He brought the cold air of the street in with him, mixed with that terrifying, suffocating scent of ozone and cedar. He looked around the cramped living room, his lip curling in a microscopic expression of disgust. You break into my home, I yelled, taking another step back toward the kitchen. Grabbing the first thing my hand touched, a heavy ceramic coffee mug. Get out! Arthur didn't even look at the mug. He signaled his men who remained in the hallway, pulling the broken door shut as best they could. We were alone. Put the mug down, Leo, Arthur said. His tone was conversational, which somehow made it vastly more terrifying. How do you know my first name? I know everything about you, he replied smoothly, unbuttoning his overcoat. I know you grew up in the foster system. I know you have $32,000 in student debt. I know you rely on subpar suppressants because you can't afford the prescription grade. He took a slow step forward. I held my ground, though my instincts were screaming at me to run. And, Arthur continued, his icy blue eyes locking onto mine, I know what you did 4 weeks ago at the Onyx Room. My breath hitched. The mug trembled in my hand. I don't know what you're talking about, I lied. It was a pathetic, transparent lie. Arthur let out a harsh, humorless exhale. Don't insult my intelligence. When I fired you 3 days ago, it wasn't just because you smelled like an Omega. It was because you smelled like my Omega. The one who slipped out of the VIP lounge before my security could get a name. I am not your Omega. I spat, gripping the mug tighter. It was a mistake. A drunken, heat-addled mistake. You left cash on the table like I was a hooker. You fired me to protect your reputation. So we're even. Get out. Arthur ignored my outburst. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a folded piece of thick cream-colored paper. He tossed it onto my small dining table. I am a thorough man, Leo, Arthur said, his voice dropping into a deadly calm register. I don't leave things to chance. When you ran off, I had the club's medical staff retrieve a sample from the glassware you used. I ran a full genetic panel. It took 3 weeks to cross-reference the dark web registries and find a match. Ironically, the match hit my desk the exact same morning you walked into my office for orientation. You ran my DNA. I felt sick. My privacy, my very biology had been stripped and analyzed without my consent. You're a monster. I am a realist, Arthur corrected. And as a realist, my private physician flagged a very specific hormonal marker in the residual sample, a marker that prompted me to have my own blood drawn. He stepped closer. The scent of him was wrapping around my throat like a physical hand. Do you know what happens to an alpha's blood chemistry when they successfully knot and impregnate an omega-1? Arthur asked, his voice a low, vibrating hum. I couldn't speak. My mouth was dry. There is an immediate spike in a specific bonding hormone. Arthur continued answering his own question. My doctor confirmed it yesterday, which brings us to today. He looked me up and down, his eyes lingering on my stomach. You are carrying my heir. The words hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. He knew. I hadn't even processed the 2 pink lines in my pocket, and he already knew. No. I choked out a tear, finally escaping and cutting a hot path down my cheek. No. I'll get rid of it. You can't force me. Arthur moved faster than I could track. In a fraction of a second, he crossed the room. He didn't hit me. He didn't grab my throat. He simply caught my wrist, the one holding the mug, and squeezed. Not enough to break bone, but enough to send a shock wave of numbness up my arm. The mug slipped from my fingers and shattered on the floor. Do not ever. Arthur whispered, his face inches from mine, his eyes burning with a terrifying primal fire. Threaten my bloodline. I gasped, frozen in his grip. The sheer force of his alpha aura was suffocating. I felt small, trapped entirely at his mercy. You are living in squalor, Arthur said, his gaze sweeping over my pale, terrified face. You have no money, no prospects, and you are carrying a child that belongs to the Croft dynasty. You think I'm going to let my heir be born in a slum to an Omega who can't even afford decent food? What do you want from me? I whispered, my voice breaking. Arthur released my wrist. He stepped back, instantly smoothing his suit jacket, the mask of the cold corporate CEO snapping back into place. You will pack whatever meager belongings hold sentimental value. My men will take care of the rest. You are moving into my penthouse. I stared at him, bewildered. You want to keep me? I want to secure my investment, Arthur replied clinically. You will be provided with the best medical care in the world. You will eat what my chefs prepare. You will sleep where my security can see you. You will carry this child to term. Once the child is born, you will sign over full parental rights to me. In exchange, I'll deposit $5 million into an offshore account in your name. You will be set for life, and you will never see the child or me again. It wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't a romance. It was a business transaction, and I was the incubator. I looked at the shattered ceramic on the floor. I thought about the $42 in my bank account. I thought about the pink plus sign burning a hole in my pocket. And if I say no? I asked softly. Arthur smiled. It was a terrible, bloodless thing. I own the bank that holds your student loans. I own the property management company that owns this building. I can make you a ghost, Leo. I can make it so you can't buy a loaf of bread in this city without my permission. The smile vanished. You don't get to say no. Grab your coat. We're leaving. The ride to the penthouse was a study in absolute suffocating silence. I sat in the back of Arthur's black Maybach, staring out the tinted window as my grim neighborhood dissolved into the gleaming steel and glass of the financial district. The car smelled like rich leather and Arthur's oppressive cedar-heavy scent. He sat on the opposite side of the spacious rear cabin, a soundproof glass divider separating us from the driver. He had an iPad open on his lap. He was reviewing quarterly earnings. He didn't look at me once. I had just been kidnapped, blackmailed, and purchased for $5 million, and he was checking profit margins. "My clothes," I said. My voice sounded thin, raspy. "I didn't pack anything." Arthur didn't look up from the screen. His finger swiped to the next page. "You don't need your clothes. They were cheap synthetic blends. I won't have static electricity or microplastics near the child. A new wardrobe has already been delivered to your quarters. Your quarters. Not a room. Not a home. A holding cell." The car descended into an underground parking garage fortress. We took a private elevator that required retinal scanning. When the polished chrome doors slid open on the penthouse floor, the sheer scale of the place physically winded me. It wasn't a home. It was a museum of modern sterility. White marble floors stretched into infinity. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a terrifying bird's-eye view of the city skyline. Everything was monochrome blacks, whites, and slate grays. There wasn't a single personal item in sight. No photos, no books, no clutter. Just sharp angles and cold surfaces. "Mrs. Gable," Arthur said, tossing his overcoat to a severe-looking older woman in a pristine gray uniform who had materialized from a hallway. "Welcome back, Mr. Croft," she said, catching the heavy wool coat with practiced ease. She didn't look at me. It was deliberate. "This is Leo," Arthur said finally, looking in my direction. "He is carrying the heir. He is not to leave this floor under any circumstances. If he requires anything, procure it. If he attempts to access the private elevator's security is to detain him." He spoke about me in the third person, right to my face. I stood there in my scuffed dress shoes and frayed jacket, feeling like a stray dog dragged into an operating room. Anger, hot and jagged, flared in my chest. "I'm a human being, not a piece of property," I snapped, stepping toward him. Arthur's eyes snapped to mine. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. He closed the distance between us in 2 long strides, invading my space. My treacherous omega biology flared, a heavy flush crawling up my neck at his proximity. "You are an investment," Arthur corrected, his voice dangerously soft. "You are an incubator for my legacy. You will eat precisely what the nutritionist outlines. You will sleep 8 hours a night. You will cease taking those toxic suppressants immediately. You will do exactly as you are told, Leo, or you will find out just how unpleasant I can be." He held my gaze, challenging me to push back. My pride screamed to hit him. My survival instinct and the new terrifying instinct blooming in my lower stomach demanded I lower my eyes. I looked at the marble floor. Arthur adjusted his cuffs. "Mrs. Gable will show you to your room. Dinner is at 7. Do not be late." He turned and walked down a long corridor, disappearing behind a heavy oak door. Mrs. Gable cleared her throat. "If you will follow me, Mr. Mercer." My room was massive, clinically white, and utterly devoid of soul. A king-sized bed dominated the space, covered in sheets that felt like spun silk. The closet was filled with high-end, comfortable clothing in neutral tones. Cashmere sweaters, soft linen trousers, silk pajamas. All in my exact size. I walked into the adjoining bathroom. It was larger than my entire previous apartment. I turned on the gold faucet, splashed freezing water on my face, and stared at my reflection. I was 24 years old. I had a degree in finance. I had plans. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the plastic pregnancy test, and set it on the marble counter. 2 pink lines. I sank to the floor, leaning my back against the cool tile, pulled my knees to my chest, and finally allowed myself to cry. I wept for the life I had just lost. I wept for the indignity of it all. And deep down in the darkest, most secret part of my mind, I wept because the scent of Arthur Croft lingering on my skin made me feel incredibly, sickeningly safe. 2 days passed in a blur of forced feeding and isolation. True to his word, Arthur ensured my life was ruthlessly scheduled. A nutritionist designed my meals bland, vitamin-rich slop that I forced down under Mrs. Gable's watchful eye. My prenatal vitamins were dispensed in a little crystal dish. The worst part was the withdrawal. I had been on generic omega suppressants for 6 years. Stopping them cold turkey was a violent shock to my nervous system. My skin burned. My joints ached. A low-grade fever settled in my bones, leaving me lethargic and constantly thirsty. But the most profound change was the scent. Without the chemical barrier, my natural omega scent began to bloom. It started faint, a warm, sweet note of toasted amber and vanilla, but by the morning of the 3rd day, it hung heavy in the air of my bedroom. It felt intrusive, naked. At 10 a.m., there was a sharp knock on my door. Before I could answer, Arthur walked in. He stopped a few feet inside the room. I was sitting on the edge of the bed, wearing one of the oversized cashmere sweaters he had bought me. I saw his nostrils flare. His pupils dilated, the icy blue iris nearly swallowed by black. His chest expanded as he took a slow, deep breath, pulling my scent into his lungs. For a fraction of a second, the cold CEO vanished. The alpha beneath the suit surfaced utterly captivated, staring at me with a hunger that made my toes curl into the plush carpet. Then he blinked. The mask slammed back into place. His jaw tightened in annoyance. "Dr. Harrison is here," Arthur said, his voice clipped and tight. "In the medical suite. Now." I didn't argue. My head throbbed too much. I followed him down the hall to a room I hadn't seen yet. It was a fully equipped private clinic smelling of antiseptic and rubbing alcohol. Dr. Harrison was a tall, middle-aged beta with kind eyes and a professional demeanor. He didn't look at me with pity or judgment, which I appreciated. "Mr. Mercer, please hop up on the table," Dr. Harrison said, gesturing to the examination bed. Arthur stood in the corner of the room, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. He was a statue of authority and control. I climbed onto the crinkly paper covering the bed. I felt entirely exposed. "We're going to start with a transabdominal ultrasound," Dr. Harrison explained, dimming the lights. "Since you are early in the first trimester, we just want to confirm viability and check the implantation site." He lifted the hem of my sweater. The cold air hit my bare stomach. Arthur shifted in the corner, his leather shoes squeaking slightly on the linoleum. Dr. Harrison squirted a dollop of warm gel onto my lower abdomen. He pressed the wand against my skin. I stared at the ceiling tiles. I didn't want to look at the monitor. If I didn't look, it wasn't real. It was just a transaction. $5 million for 9 months of my life. A temporary inconvenience. "Ah," Dr. Harrison said softly. "There we are." He tapped a few keys on the machine. Suddenly a sound filled the quiet room. Whoosh, 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 whoosh. Fast, rhythmic, determined. It was a heartbeat. The air vanished from my lungs. I squeezed my eyes shut, but it didn't help. The sound bypassed my ears and hammered directly into my chest. My hands flew down, grasping the edges of the exam table so hard my knuckles popped. It was real. There was a life inside of me. A tiny, furious heartbeat that belonged to a child. My child. My omega biology, repressed for so long, brutalized by cheap chemicals and corporate ambition, woke up in a blinding flash of maternal instinct. A fierce, irrational wave of protectiveness washed over me. I wanted to curl around my stomach. I wanted to build a nest. I wanted to hide. I opened my eyes, tears blurring my vision, and looked at the monitor. A tiny pulsating gray blob in a sea of static. I couldn't help it. I looked over at Arthur. I expected him to look triumphant, smug. He had secured his investment. But Arthur wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the monitor. His arms had dropped to his sides. His posture, usually so rigidly perfect, had slackened. The icy calculation in his eyes was completely gone, replaced by a raw, unvarnished awe. He looked utterly wrecked by the sound of that rapid heartbeat. He took a step forward, drawn by an invisible tether. His eyes flicked from the screen to my face. For the first time since I met him, Arthur Croft looked vulnerable. Our eyes locked. In that dim room, over the frantic rhythm of the ultrasound, a silent, terrifying acknowledgement passed between us. The transaction was a lie. We were tethered by blood biology and the overwhelming gravity of the life growing between us. Dr. Harrison cleared his throat, snapping the spell. Arthur instantly stiffened. He took a sharp step back, retreating into the shadows of the corner. He ran a hand over his tie, restoring his armor. Heart rate is 165 beats per minute. Strong and healthy, Dr. Harrison announced cheerfully. He handed me a paper towel to wipe the gel off. Ensure he receives the premium prenatal supplements. Arthur commanded, his voice back to its usual deadpan rumble. He didn't look at me again. He turned on his heel and strode out of the clinic, leaving the heavy scent of cedar and ozone in his wake. I wiped my stomach, my hands shaking. The heartbeat echoed in my ears long after the machine was turned off. By the end of the second week, the penthouse had become a pressure cooker. My suppressants were entirely flushed from my system. I felt raw, painfully hyper-aware of my surroundings and constantly exhausted. My scent was no longer a subtle whisper of vanilla and amber. It was a loud, demanding presence that saturated the carpets, the furniture, and the air filtration system. It was driving Arthur insane. He tried to hide it. He spent 16 hours a day at the office. When he was home, he locked himself in his study. But I saw the physical toll it was taking on him. Omegaverse biology is a cruel, uncompromising master. An alpha is genetically hardwired to protect, provide for, and be near their pregnant mate. Arthur's logical brain viewed me as a contract worker. His alpha biology viewed me as his world. The cognitive dissonance was tearing him apart. It came to a head on a Tuesday night. A massive thunderstorm had rolled over the city. Thunder cracked so loud it rattled the reinforced glass of the penthouse windows. Lightning bathed the dark living room in strobing flashes of silver. I couldn't sleep. The pressure changes in the atmosphere made my joints ache, and a deep primal anxiety was gnawing at my nerves. I wandered out of my bedroom, dragging a heavy cashmere blanket behind me, like a child's security blanket. I went to the kitchen, intending to heat some milk. I didn't turn on the lights. A sharp crack of thunder shook the floorboards. I flinched, dropping my mug in the sink with a loud clatter. "What are you doing?" The voice came from the darkness near the island counter. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. Lightning flashed, illuminating Arthur. He was sitting on a bar stool, a half-empty glass of amber liquid in his hand. He had discarded his suit jacket and tie. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, his sleeves rolled up to his forearms. He looked exhausted, dangerous. I couldn't sleep, I said, my voice trembling slightly. Arthur set the glass down. The sound was deafening in the quiet kitchen. He stood up. "You should be in bed," he said, his voice a low, gravelly hum. He stepped toward me. As he moved, his scent hit me. It wasn't the usual crisp-controlled ozone. It was thick, heavy, and laced with dark, simmering frustration. "I'm fine." I lied backing up until my lower back hit the edge of the marble counter. Arthur kept coming. He didn't stop until he was standing just inches away. I had to tilt my head back to look at him. His eyes were entirely black, his pupils dilated to the edge of the iris. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling in a slow, predatory rhythm. "You are distressed," he murmured, leaning down. "It's just the storm," I whispered. My body was betraying me. My knees felt weak. The vanilla in my scent flared thick with anxiety and a desperate biological need for comfort. Arthur's hands came up. I flinched, expecting him to grab my shoulders to give me an order. Instead, his large warm palms flattened against the marble counter on either side of my hips, caging me in. He leaned his weight forward, trapping me between the counter and the hard wall of his chest. He didn't touch me, but the heat radiating from him was a physical weight. He lowered his head, burying his face in the crook of my neck. I gasped. My hands instinctively came up, hovering over his chest, unsure whether to push him away or pull him closer. Arthur inhaled deeply, a long, shuddering breath that pulled my scent directly into his lungs. I felt the scrape of his stubble against my collarbone. He let out a low, vibrating rumble from deep in his chest, an alpha purr. It was an involuntary sound meant to soothe an anxious mate. The sound resonated through my bones. The anxiety that had been clawing at me all night vanished, replaced by a heavy, languid warmth. My muscles melted. I slumped against the counter, my head falling to the side, bearing my neck further to him. It was pure, unadulterated biology. We were two animals acting on instinct. "Arthur," I breathed. My voice broke the spell. Arthur went rigidly still. The purr died in his chest. He pulled his head back, his breathing ragged. He looked at my flushed face, at my exposed neck, and a look of profound self-disgust washed over his features. He pushed himself away from the counter, violently putting 3 feet of distance between us. He ran a shaking hand through his perfectly styled hair, ruining it. "Drink your milk and go to bed, Mercer," he said, his voice cold, harsh, and entirely detached. The CEO was back firmly in control. He grabbed his glass of scotch and walked out of the kitchen without a backward glance. I stood there in the dark, shivering in the sudden absence of his heat, clutching the blanket to my chest. The walls of my gilded cage were closing in, and I was terrified to realize that I was starting to rely on my captor. The kitchen incident drew a permanent, invisible line through the penthouse. Arthur retreated entirely. I didn't see him for 6 days. He left before I woke and returned long after I had been forced into bed by Mrs. Gable. My only proof that he still existed was the fresh scent of crushed cedar lingering in the hallway each morning. Isolation is a weapon. It slowly strips away your grip on reality. By day 10, I was talking to the sleek stainless steel refrigerator just to hear a voice. Then the guard detail changed. His name was Hayes. He wasn't like the other security personnel who treated me like a volatile explosive. Hayes was a beta built like a brick wall, with a jagged scar cutting through his left eyebrow and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. On his first morning shift, he found me sitting on the floor of the living room, staring blankly at the muted television. He didn't hover. He didn't bark an order. He walked over, dropped a heavy tactical trauma kit onto the glass coffee table, and knelt beside me. "Blood pressure," Hayes said. His voice was a flat, gravelly rasp. I blinked at him. "Dr. Harrison checks that on Fridays." "Dr. Harrison is a glorified pill pusher for the 1%, Hayes replied, unzipping the kit. He pulled out a dark nylon cuff. "I spent 4 years as a combat medic in Kandahar. I trust my own gear. Arm." I hesitated, then held out my arm. His hands were calloused and warm. He wrapped the cuff with practiced, efficient speed. He didn't handle me like a fragile glass doll, and the relief of being touched like a normal human being nearly brought me to tears. He pumped the bulb. The nylon squeezed. He watched the gauge, his face impassive. 110/70. Heart rate is a little high. Hayes muttered, ripping the Velcro loose. He packed the gear away. "You aren't eating enough. The food tastes like cardboard." "It's optimized. Doesn't mean it's good." Hayes leaned back on his heels, resting his forearms on his thighs. He looked at me, really looked at me, stripping away the multi-million-dollar contract and the biological designation. "You're suffocating in here, Mercer." "I'm an incubator," I said bitterly. "Incubators don't need fresh air." Hayes let out a short, humorless exhale. "Is that what he told you? $5 million and a ticket out?" "Yes." Hayes shook his head slowly. "Croft is a bastard, but he's a calculating bastard. He didn't drag you up here just because his biology went haywire. You're a human shield." I frowned, pulling my knees to my chest. "What are you talking about?" Hayes glanced toward the hallway cameras, then lowered his voice. "The Croft Family Trust. It's an ironclad piece of corporate tyranny written by Arthur's grandfather. Arthur holds the CEO title, but the board holds the majority voting rights to the trust. There's a stipulation. If the sitting CEO does not produce a legitimate blood heir by his 33rd birthday, control of the majority shares defaults to the board." The breath caught in my throat. "Arthur turns 33 in 4 months, Hayes continued. "The board smells blood in the water. They've been circling, preparing to oust him, dismantle the company, and sell off the assets. They despise him because he doesn't play their old money games. He's too ruthless, too efficient." The pieces slammed into place. The DNA test, the immediate kidnapping, the utter refusal to let me out of his sight. "I'm his retaining wall," I whispered. "You're his literal lifeline," Hayes corrected. "If you miscarry, or if you disappear, Arthur loses the company he built out of his father's ashes. The board takes it all. That's why you're locked in a vault. You aren't just carrying a baby Mercer. You're carrying Croft Industries, a cold, hard knot formed in my stomach. I wasn't just a victim of biology. I was a pawn in a multi-billion-dollar corporate war. Arthur had looked me in the eye and played the possessive alpha, hiding the fact that he was actually fighting for his professional survival. Anger, pure and white-hot, finally burned through the lethargy of my withdrawal. I stood up. My bare feet slapped against the marble. "Where is he?" I demanded. "Boardroom." Hayes said, a faint smirk playing on his lips. He liked the fight in me. "But he's hosting a private dinner here tonight. The executive board, a show of force, to prove the heir is real." "Is he?" I walked toward my room, my hands balling into fists. "Well, if I'm going to be a human shield, I'm not doing it in a cashmere sweater." The penthouse was transformed by 7 p.m. The sterile silence was replaced by the low hum of classical music and the suffocating, clashing scents of a dozen high-tier alphas and betas. They were the Croft Industries Board of Directors. Old men in tailored suits, smelling of expensive cigars, stale arrogance, and predatory intent. Arthur stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, a glass of bourbon in his hand. He wore a midnight blue suit that looked like armor. His face was an emotionless mask, but his scent, that sharp ozone, was erratic spiking, with barely controlled aggression every time a board member stepped too close. I waited in the hallway. Mrs. Gable had tried to force me into a soft, submissive silk tunic. I locked her out of my room. Instead, I dug through the back of the massive closet until I found a slate-gray suit. It wasn't my cheap navy polyester, but it was tailored sharp and entirely professional. I didn't bother with scent blockers. Let them smell me. Let them smell exactly what they were trying to destroy. I stepped into the living room. The conversation died instantly. 12 pairs of eyes snapped to me. The air grew thick-heavy with the oppressive weight of alpha posturing. Arthur turned. The glass in his hand halted halfway to his mouth. His eyes swept over the suit, the set of my jaw, the absolute refusal to lower my gaze. A muscle ticked in his cheek. A man in his late 60s, sporting a silver mane and a condescending smile, stepped forward. This was Preston, the chairman of the board, the man trying to steal Arthur's empire. "Ah," Preston said, his voice dripping with false warmth. "The miraculous Omega. Arthur, you kept him entirely off the radar. We were beginning to think he was a figment of your legal department's imagination." Preston looked me up and down, dissecting me. "Tell me, boy, where did Arthur find you? A high-end agency? Or did he just pluck you out of an alley and buy you a bath?" A low growl vibrated in the room. It came from Arthur. He set his glass down, his eyes locked on Preston with murderous intent. Before Arthur could move, I stepped forward. "I was a senior financial analyst for this company, Mr. Preston," I said. My voice was calm, projecting perfectly across the dead silent room. "Before that, I graduated top of my class at NYU Stern." Preston's smile faltered slightly. He hadn't expected me to speak. Omegas in their circles were seen, not heard. "Is that so?" Preston sneered. "Fascinating. Though I suppose reading a spreadsheet doesn't require much pedigree." "It requires enough pedigree to recognize gross negligence." I fired back, stepping closer. The underdog in me, the kid who fought for scraps his whole life, completely took the wheel. For instance, I read the quarterly projections for the logistics division before I was reassigned to this specialized role. Your pet project, the overseas shipping initiative. Preston's scent flared with sudden bitter panic. "That is confidential board material." "It's a massive hemorrhage of capital," I interrupted, my tone surgical. "You've over-leveraged the company's assets on outdated freight contracts. You're bleeding $15 million a quarter, and you're hiding it in shell subsidiaries. You don't want Arthur out because he lacks an heir. You want him out because he ordered an internal audit, and you know he's about to find the bodies you buried." Dead silence. The music seemed to stop. The other board members exchanged nervous, shifting glances. Preston's face flushed a deep mottled purple. He took a threatening step toward me, his alpha aura exploding outward in a violent wave of dominance meant to crush me to the floor. "You insolent little—" Preston snarled, raising a hand. He never finished the sentence. Arthur moved with terrifying, blinding speed. He crossed the room and slammed his hand around Preston's throat. The momentum carried the older alpha backward until he crashed against the reinforced glass of the window. The remaining board members scattered, shouting in alarm. "Touch him!" Arthur whispered, his voice a demonic vibrating rasp that shook the floorboards. "Look at him. Breathe in his direction again, Preston, and I will throw you through this glass and watch you paint the pavement." Preston choked, clawing uselessly at Arthur's steel grip. "Get out," Arthur commanded, not looking at the others. His eyes were completely black, locked on the man suffocating in his hand. "All of you, now. If you ever question the legitimacy of my mate or my heir again, I won't just fire you. I will ruin your bloodlines." The board members scrambled for the elevators like frightened rats. Arthur released Preston, who collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. "Run," Arthur told him. Preston scrambled up and fled. The heavy oak door slammed shut. The penthouse was empty save for Arthur, me, and Hayes, who was standing quietly in the shadow of the hallway, his hand resting casually on his holstered weapon. Arthur stood by the window, his chest heaving, his hands shaking with residual adrenaline. The room was thick with his violent protective scent. I stood in the center of the wreckage, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I had done it. I had called their bluff. I had fought back, and then a sharp searing pain ripped through my lower abdomen. It wasn't a cramp. It felt like a knife twisting into my organs. I gasped, my hands flying to my stomach. My knees gave out instantly. I hit the marble floor hard. "Leo." Arthur's voice cracked. The alpha dominance vanished, replaced by sheer, unadulterated terror. He dropped to his knees beside me, his hands hovering over my body, terrified to touch me, terrified to break me further. The pain surged again, blinding white. I curled into a ball, a broken sob tearing from my throat. I felt a horrifying warm dampness spreading against the inside of my thighs. "Blood!" I choked out, panic suffocating me. "Arthur, there's blood!" "Hayes!" Arthur roared a sound of pure agony. "Get Harrison! Get the chopper! Do something!" Arthur was paralyzed. The billionaire who controlled empires was completely undone by the sight of my pain. Hayes was there in a second. The combat medic took over. He shoved Arthur out of the way with a physical force that would have gotten any other man killed. "Back off, Croft. You're suffocating him," Hayes barked, dropping his trauma kit to the floor. He knelt beside me, his hands steady his scent, completely neutral and grounding. "Leo, look at me," Hayes commanded, his voice cutting through my panic like a scalpel. "Look at my eyes." I forced my eyes open, locking onto the scar above his brow. "Breathe with me. In through the nose, out through the mouth. You're hyperventilating. It's making the cramping worse." Hayes' hands moved over my abdomen, applying a firm, steady pressure that somehow anchored the pain. "It's a stress response. Massive adrenaline dump. The body is contracting to protect the core. We need to lower your heart rate now." "He's bleeding," Arthur yelled, pacing like a caged animal behind us. "Spotting," Hayes corrected sharply, without looking back. "Common in first trimester stress events. Croft, shut up and project calm or get out of the room. Your panic is feeding his." Arthur froze. He forced his eyes shut, took a ragged breath, and forcibly locked his aura down. The suffocating ozone faded, replaced by a desperate, pleading warmth. Hayes pulled a small syringe from his kit. "Smooth muscle relaxant. It's safe. It'll stop the spasms." He uncapped it and slid it into the muscle of my thigh. I hissed, but almost immediately the blinding edges of the pain began to dull. The knife twisted backward, leaving a deep throbbing ache in its wake. "I've got you," Hayes said quietly, wiping a cold sweat from my forehead. "You're okay. The kid is dug in deep. Just breathe." I lay on the cold marble, shivering violently, clutching Hayes' tactical vest. I looked past his shoulder. Arthur was on his knees a few feet away. He looked entirely broken. The tailored suit was ruined, his tie discarded. He was staring at my stomach as if praying to a god he didn't believe in. This wasn't a business transaction anymore. The contract was dead. We had crossed a line written in blood and boardroom politics, and there was absolutely no going back. The medical suite was silent, except for the rhythmic, steady whoosh-whoosh of the fetal heart monitor. Dr. Harrison had arrived 10 minutes after Hayes stabilized me. He ran a battery of tests, performed another ultrasound, and confirmed what the medic had already diagnosed. It was an acute stress response, a warning shot from my biology. The baby was fine, but I was placed on mandatory bed rest for 48 hours. I was lying on the examination table, a warm blanket draped over me. I felt exhausted, hollowed out, but grounded. Hayes stood by the door, arms crossed, keeping a silent watch. Arthur sat in a plastic chair in the corner of the room. He had been staring at the floor for the last hour. He hadn't said a word since Hayes had yelled at him in the living room. Dr. Harrison finished packing his briefcase. "Keep him hydrated. No stress, no stares. I'll be back tomorrow morning to check his vitals." He nodded to Hayes and slipped out the door. The heavy silence returned. "Hayes," Arthur said, his voice quiet and rough. "Leave us." Hayes looked at me. I gave him a tiny nod. The beta pushed off the door frame and stepped into the hall, closing the door behind him with a soft click. We were alone. Arthur finally lifted his head. The icy, untouchable CEO was gone. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face pale beneath the harsh fluorescent lights of the clinic. He looked his age. He looked human. He stood up, slowly walked over to the exam table, and stopped. He didn't invade my space. He kept his hands at his sides. "When I saw you on the floor," Arthur started, his voice barely above a whisper. He swallowed hard. "When you said there was blood, I felt the world stop." I watched him carefully. "You thought you lost the company." Arthur flinched as if I had struck him. He squeezed his eyes shut. "No. God, no. The company didn't even cross my mind. All I could think was that I broke you, that I pushed you too hard, and I destroyed the only real thing in my life." He reached into the inner pocket of his ruined suit jacket. He pulled out a thick legal document bound in a blue folder. I recognized it instantly. It was the contract, the $5 million severance package, the agreement that legally reduced me to an incubator. Arthur didn't open it. He didn't ask me to sign it. He gripped the thick stack of paper in both hands and tore it directly down the middle. The sound of the heavy paper ripping was the loudest thing in the room. He placed the two torn halves on top of each other and tore them again, completely destroying the document. He dropped the shredded remains into the biohazard bin next to the sink. "I'm done," Arthur said, turning back to me. "The transaction is over." I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders. "What does that mean, Arthur? Because if I don't sign over my rights, the board will tear you apart." "Let them try," Arthur said. The cold fire returned to his eyes, but this time it wasn't directed at me. "You were right tonight. I have the audit. I have Preston by the throat. I don't need a biological loophole to keep my company. I will burn the current board to the ground and rebuild it from the ashes. I will take accountability for every corrupt practice my father installed." He took a step closer, resting his hands on the edge of the examination table. "I brought you here under the guise of a business arrangement because it was the only way I knew how to operate." Arthur confessed, his voice dropping into a rough, desperate cadence. "I am a ruthless man, Leo. I have to be. But that night at the club, it wasn't just heat. It wasn't just biology. You looked at me and you didn't see the money. You didn't care about the name. You just saw me." He slowly reached out. He didn't grab my wrist. He hovered his hand over mine, asking for permission. I uncurled my fingers and let him take my hand. His grip was warm, gentle, and utterly devoted. "I don't want an incubator," Arthur whispered, looking down at our joined hands. "I don't want a human shield. I want a partner. I want someone who will stand in a room full of wolves and tell them exactly how they are failing. I want you." I looked at him. The man who had fired me. The man who had kidnapped me. The man who had just dismantled his own armor to stand bare before me. "I'm not a submissive, Omega Arthur." I warned him, my voice steady despite the tears pricking my eyes. "I will not stay locked in a penthouse. I will not be a secret. And I am keeping my career." A genuine, startlingly beautiful smile broke across Arthur's face. It completely changed him. The ice melted. "Croft Industries is currently in need of a chief financial officer," Arthur said softly. "The current one is about to be indicted for fraud." I let out a wet laugh, squeezing his hand. "Nepotism on day one. You really are corrupt." "I am entirely corrupt when it comes to you," Arthur agreed, leaning down. He pressed his forehead against mine. His scent washed over me, no longer oppressive, no longer commanding. It was a shelter, a promise. Cedar and ozone grounded in the reality of the life we were about to build. "No more contracts," I whispered against his lips. "No more contracts," Arthur echoed. "Just us." He kissed me. It wasn't rough or desperate like the club. It was slow, careful, and deeply reverent. It was the sealing of a true bond not forged by a billionaire's legal team, but by an underdog who fought back, and the alpha who finally learned how to surrender. Leo refused to be a pawn, and in doing so he conquered the boardroom and the billionaire's cold heart. The contract is torn. The corrupt board is going down, and a true grounded partnership has begun. But the corporate world never sleeps, and rebuilding an empire is a dangerous game. Did you love Leo's fierce defiance and Arthur's ultimate surrender? If this deeply human Omegaverse story kept you hooked, smash that like button right now. Share this video with fellow drama lovers, and hit subscribe so you never miss our next explosive audio drama. What should happen next? Comment below.